The autumn morning carried the kind of silence that small towns cherish, a peaceful quiet that settles over neighborhoods like a well-worn blanket in Milford population 3,847. That silence had been hard-won. 3 years had passed since the disappearance of 10-year-old Emily Harris had torn through the community like wildfire. In 2 years since the case had been officially closed. The drifter Marcus Powell had confessed before dying of a heart attack in state prison. Case closed. Justice served. Life could finally move forward. Jack Turner sat on his front porch, nursing his second cup of coffee and watching the maple leaves spiral down into his yard. At 62, retirement hadn't been kind to him. 28 years, as Milford's finest, and now his days stretched endlessly ahead, filled with little more than crossword puzzles and reruns of old westerns. Beside him, sprawled across the weathered wooden planks, lay Rex, a German shepherd, whose black and tan coat had faded to silver. Around the muzzle, whose sharp brown eyes had grown cloudy with age. Rex had been Jack's partner for 8 years. Before they'd both retired. Together they'd solved dozens of cases, tracked countless suspects, and brought closure to families across 3 counties. Rex's nose was legendary in law enforcement. Sir Koza, precision instrument that could follow a scent trail. Days old, distinguish between identical twins and find evidence that human eyes missed completely. But these days Rex, mostly, slept. The fire that once burned in his alert stance had dimmed to occasional flickers when the mailman approached, or when Mrs. Chen from next door brought over her homemade pot roast. Jack often wondered if Rex missed the work as much as he did, or if the old dog was simply content to let his golden years pass in peaceful slumber. The sound of a car door slamming broke the morning stillness. Jack looked up to see Martha Henley, his neighbor from 2 houses down, approaching with a cardboard box clutched against her chest. Martha was one of those women who seemed to know everyone's business while somehow never being accused of gossip, a talent that made her invaluable during the church rummage sales she organized twice yearly. "Jack," she called out, slightly breathless from the walk, "I hope you don't mind me stopping by so early." "Not at all, Martha. Coffee's still warm, if you want some." She shook her head, setting the box down on his porch steps. "I'm cleaning out Tom's study. Know how he hoarded everything, and I found this box of old police files and evidence bags. I figured instead of throwing them away, maybe you could donate them to the department, or use them for training or something." Jack's interest piqued. Tom Henley had been the police chief before Jack joined the force, a legend in his own right who'd served Milford for 40 years before retiring. If anyone would have interesting cases tucked away, it would be Tom. "That's thoughtful of you." "Martha, what kind of files?" "Oh, you know Tom, he kept everything cold. Cases closed. Cases, evidence from decades ago that he never could bring himself to throw away. I swear that man saved every piece of paper that crossed his desk." She paused, her expression growing somber, including some things from the Emily Harris cassette. The mention of Emily's name, Jack felt the familiar tightness in his chest. The case had haunted every officer who'd worked at a 10-year-old girl, vanishing without a trace on her way home from school. 3 weeks of searching, hundreds of volunteers, K-9 units from 4 counties including Jack and Rex. The whole town had mobilized, and for 3 agonizing weeks they'd found nothing. Then Marcus Powell had been arrested for an unrelated burglary, and during questioning, he'd broken down and confessed to Emily's abduction and murder. He'd claimed he'd buried her body in the national forest, but despite extensive searches, her remains were never found. Powell died in prison 6 months later, taking any hope of finding Emily with him to the grave. "I should probably look through this stuff before donating it," Jack said, pulling the box toward him. "Make sure there's nothing sensitive in there." Martha nodded. "I figured you'd know what to do with it better than I would." "Well, I'll let you get back to your coffee. Tell Nancy I said hello when you talk to her." Jack thanked her and watched as she walked back down the street, her small figure disappearing behind the hedge that separated their properties. Nancy was his ex-wife who'd left him 2 years after his retirement, claiming she couldn't stand watching him turn into a ghost. Maybe she'd been right. Maybe that's exactly what he'd become. He carried the box inside, Rex trailing slowly behind him in his kitchen, surrounded by the smell of coffee and the distant sound of morning television. Jack opened the cardboard flaps. The box was packed tight with manila folders, evidence bags, and loose photographs. On top lay a thick file labeled Harris, Emily, missing person, CLO/SID. Jack's hands trembled slightly as he lifted the file. Inside were crime scene photographs, witness statements, search reports, all the documentation of those hellish 3 weeks when the town had held its collective breath. And there in a clear plastic evidence bag was something that made Jack's heart skip. A small pink scarf with white polka dots. Emily's scarf. She'd been wearing it the day she disappeared, according to her mother's statement. It had been found caught on a fence post 2 miles from where she was last seen, torn and dirty, but unmistakably hers. Jack remembered the day they'd bagged it, how her mother had broken down when she'd identified it, how they'd all hoped it would lead to a breakthrough. Without thinking, Jack opened the evidence bag and pulled the scarf out. The fabric was soft, despite its age, still carrying a faint scent of lavender. Fabric softener mixed with something else, something earthier, sadder. He held it up to the morning light streaming through his kitchen window. studying the delicate pattern, remembering the press conference where Emily's picture had been displayed next to a description of what she was wearing. That's when Rex, who had been lying quietly by the kitchen table, suddenly lifted his head. The old dog's ears, which had been drooping with age and inattention, shot up like antenna dishes. His cloudy eyes, focused with an intensity Jack hadn't seen in years, rose to his feet slowly at first. Then, with growing urgency, he approached Jack with measured steps, his nose working the air. When he caught the full scent of the scarf, everything changed. The transformation was instantaneous and shocking. Rex's entire body went rigid, his hackles rising along his spine. A low whine built in his throat, escalating quickly into sharp, urgent barks. It wasn't the casual bark of an old dog being mildly interested. This was the focused, insistent bark of a working canine who'd caught the scent of something vital. Jack dropped the scarf in surprise. Rex immediately pounced on it, not to destroy it, but to investigate it thoroughly. His nose moved over every inch of the fabric while his barks continued echoing off the kitchen walls. The sound was so unusual, so charged with meaning, that Jack felt the hair on his own arms stand up. Rex, what is it, boy? Jack knelt beside his old partner, his heart racing. What do you smell? But even as he asked the question, Jack already knew the answer. Rex smelled something that didn't fit the official story. Rex smelled a lie. And after 8 years as partners, Jack trusted that knows more than he trusted most people. Rex pawed at the scarf, then looked up at Jack with eyes that seemed to hold all the urgency and frustration of a dog who couldn't speak but desperately needed to communicate. Then he did something he hadn't done in over 2 years. He ran to the front door and scratched at it, whining and looking back at Jack expectantly. The old dog wanted to work. He wanted to follow the trail that everyone else had missed. Jack looked at the scarf lying on his kitchen floor, then at Rex standing by the door, every line of his aging body taut with purpose. The case was closed. Marcus Powell was dead. The town had moved on, but Rex's nose didn't lie, and right now, Rex was telling him that everything they thought they knew about Emily Harris was wrong. Outside, Milford continued its quiet morning routine, unaware that in a small kitchen on Maple Street, a retired cop and his aging canine partner were about to resurrect a case that everyone believed was finished. Jack reached for his coat with hands that shook slightly from age, from fear, or from the electric anticipation of the hunt beginning again. He couldn't say all he knew was that Rex's nose had never failed him before, and he wasn't about to doubt it. Now Jack stood by his front door for a long moment, watching Rex's behavior with growing unease. The old dog hadn't moved from his position, hadn't stopped his urgent whining. Every few seconds, Rex would look back at Jack, then at the door, then back at Jack again. A clear communication that any experienced canine handler would recognize. Rex had caught a scent trail, and he wanted to follow it. But this wasn't just any case. This was Emily Harris, the case that had nearly broken the entire police department. The case that had been solved officially and definitively when Marcus Powell confessed. Jack could still remember the relief that had washed over the town when Powell's confession came to light. Parents could sleep again. Children could walk to school without escorts. The monster had been caught and had died in prison, taking Milford's nightmare with him, or so they'd all believed. Jack pulled out his cell phone and stared at the screen, thumb hovering over Chief Morrison's number. Morrison had been a sergeant during the original investigation. One of Jack's closest colleagues now, he ran the department with the kind of steady competence that kept small towns functioning smoothly. Morrison would listen to Jack's concerns. They'd been friends for 15 years, but Jack could already imagine the conversation. Jack, you know I respect you and Rex, but the case is closed, Powell confessed. We have closure. The last thing this town needs is to reopen old wounds based on a dog's reaction to a 3-year-old piece of evidence. And Morrison would be right, wouldn't he? Rex's sharp bark interrupted Jack's hesitation. The dog had moved to the window and was staring out at something with laser focus. Jack followed his gaze and saw nothing unusual. Just the quiet street, Mrs. Chen watering her flower boxers, the Hendersons' cat stalking something in their front yard. But Rex saw something else, smelled something else, something that made his entire body vibrate with barely contained energy. Jack made his decision. He clipped Rex's old leather leash to his collar, a leash that hadn't been used for active duty in over 2 years, but still felt natural in Jack's hands. The moment the leash was secured, Rex bolted for the door with surprising strength, nearly pulling Jack off his feet. Easy boy, Jack murmured, but his heart was racing with an excitement he hadn't felt since retirement. Let's see what you've got. The moment they stepped outside, Rex's behavior became even more focused. His nose went to the ground, sweeping back and forth in the methodical pattern Jack remembered so well. For a few seconds, Rex searched near the porch steps, his breathing audible as he sorted through the various scents that accumulated around any house garbage. Pickup delivery trucks, neighborhood dogs, countless human visitors. Then he found it. His head snapped up, oriented toward the east, and he began pulling Jack down the sidewalk with a determination that belied his advanced age. They moved past Martha Henley's house, past the small park where Emily used to play, toward the edge of town, where the residential neighborhoods gave way to farmland and eventually to the state forest. Jack felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. This was the same direction Emily had been walking the day she disappeared, the same route that had been searched exhaustively by dozens of officers and hundreds of volunteers. If Rex was following Emily's scent trail, he was following a path that should have led them to answers 3 years ago. But as they walked, Jack began to notice something that made his stomach twist with unease. Rex wasn't following the exact route Emily should have taken home from school. Instead, he was angling off the main road, following a path that led toward the more expensive part of town, the area where Milford's successful business owners and longtime families lived in houses set back from the road behind manicured lawns and privacy hedges. After 20 minutes of steady walking with Rex showing no signs of fatigue, despite his age, they reached the outskirts of the Willowbrook development. This was where Milford's elite lived: doctors, lawyers, the bank president, successful contractors who'd built half the town's new construction over the past decade. Jack had been to some of these houses before for holiday parties and retirement celebrations. These were good people, pillars of the community, folks who sponsored little league teams and funded scholarship programs. Rex paused at the entrance to Willowbrook, his nose working the air more intensively. Jack could see the concentration in the dog's posture, the way his ears swiveled to catch sounds too subtle for human perception. Then Rex made a decision that sent ice through Jack's veins. He turned left onto Willowbrook, pulling Jack toward a cluster of houses that included some of the most respected names in Milford. "Rex, are you sure about this?" Jack whispered, though he knew the question was pointless. Rex had never been wrong about a scent trail, not in 8 years of partnership. If Rex said the trail led this way, then this was where Emily Harris had been 3 years ago. The implications hit Jack like a physical blow. If Emily's scent trail led into Willowbrook, it meant she'd been in contact with someone who lived here, someone with money, influence, and a reputation to protect, someone who'd managed to keep their involvement secret while an innocent drifter rotted in prison for a crime he might not have committed. Rex's pace quickened and Jack found himself being pulled toward a specific section of the development. The houses here were set far back from the road, surrounded by tall oak trees and evergreen hedges that provided substantial privacy. Jack recognized several of the mailboxes. They passed the town doctor, a successful real estate developer, the owner of the largest construction company in 3 counties. Then Rex stopped abruptly in front of a particularly imposing property. The house sat at the end of a long driveway, mostly hidden behind mature landscaping. The mailbox read Briggs in elegant script, and Jack's heart sank as recognition hit him. Walter Briggs owned Briggs Construction, the company that had built most of Milford's recent development projects. More importantly, Walter was one of the police department's most generous supporters. He'd donated the funds for their new canine vehicle, sponsored the annual policeman's ball, and had been instrumental in getting Morrison promoted to chief. Rex was staring at the Briggs property with an intensity that made Jack's hands shake. The old dog's nose was pointing like a compass needle toward something beyond the hedge, something his superior senses could detect, but that remained invisible to Jack. "This can't be right," Jack muttered, but even as he said it, he knew he was lying to himself. Rex's nose didn't make mistakes. Rex's nose didn't care about reputations or political connections or generous donations to police departments. Rex's nose only cared about the truth. A sound from within the Briggs property made both Jack and Rex freeze. The distant sound of something burning, accompanied by the acrid smell of smoke. Jack pulled out his phone and activated the camera, zooming in on the parts of the property visible through gaps in the hedge in the backyard. He could make out a figure moving around what appeared to be a burn barrel, feeding something into the flames. Even from this distance, Jack recognized Walter Briggs's tall, lean frame and distinctive silver hair. At 65, Walter moved with the easy confidence of a man who'd built an empire from nothing and commanded respect wherever he went. Jack had known Walter for years, had accepted his charitable donations on behalf of the department, had attended barbecues at this very house. The idea that this man, this pillar of the community, could have any connection to Emily Harris's disappearance seemed absurd, but Rex's rigid posture and the way the dog's hackles were rising told a different story. Rex was detecting something that triggered every instinct the dog had developed during years of tracking criminals and finding evidence. Snapped several photos with his phone, though he wasn't sure what he was documenting. Walter burning something in his backyard wasn't illegal or even unusual. Plenty of people in Milford still burned their yard waste and old papers. But the timing felt wrong, the location felt wrong, and most of all, Rex's reaction felt like a warning. As Jack watched through his phone's zoom lens, Walter straightened up from the burn barrel and seemed to stare directly toward the road, as if he'd sensed their presence even from this distance. Jack could see the way Walter's expression shifted from casual attention to something sharper, more alert. For a moment that felt like hours, the two men stared at each other across the manicured landscape, hidden behind hedges with an aging police dog, the other standing beside a fire that might be consuming evidence of crimes No one wanted to believe then Rex, who had been silent and focused for the past hour, suddenly erupted into a series of sharp, urgent barks that echoed off the surrounding houses like gunshots. The sound was so loud, so distinctly, that of a working police dog, alerting to a significant find, that Jack felt his training kick in. Despite his shock, Walter Briggs heard the barking. Too, Jack watched as the man's entire posture changed, his casual demeanor evaporating into something cold and calculating. Walter's eyes, now clearly visible even at this distance, locked onto Jack's position with a recognition that sent chills down. The retired officer's spine, the smile that had been Walter's trademark for decades, was completely gone, replaced by an expression Jack had seen before on the faces of suspects who'd just realized their secrets were about to be exposed. In that moment, Jack understood that Rex hadn't led them to a coincidence or a false trail. Rex had led them to the truth about Emily Harris, and that truth was standing beside a burned barrel, staring back at them with the cold calculation of a man who'd thought he'd gotten away with murder. Jack's hands shook as he pulled Rex away from the hedge, his mind racing with the implications of what they'd just discovered. The case wasn't closed, it had never been closed, and the real monster had been hiding in plain sight for 3 years, accepting thanks for his community service, while an innocent man died in prison. They walked quickly back toward town, Rex padding beside him with the satisfied air of a job well done. Jack knew there was no going back. The trail had been found, the scent had been followed, and the truth was beginning to surface. But he also knew that confronting Walter Briggs directly would be suicide, not just for his own reputation, but possibly for his and Rex's safety. Briggs had money, influence, and 3 years' worth of reasons to keep his secrets buried. But Rex's nose had just thrown the first shovel of dirt out of a grave that someone had worked very hard to dig. The question now wasn't whether the truth would come out. Rex had already guaranteed that. The question was whether Jack and Rex would live long enough to see justice served. Jack didn't sleep that night. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling while Rex paced restlessly through the house, occasionally stopping to whine at the front door. The old dog's behavior had been increasingly agitated since their return from Willowbrook, as if he understood the significance of what they'd discovered and was frustrated by his inability to communicate the urgency he felt. By 4 a.m., Jack gave up on sleep entirely. He made coffee, sat at his kitchen table, and tried to make sense of what they'd uncovered. Emily Harris's scent trail led directly to Walter Briggs's property. Walter had been burning something in his backyard. Rex's reaction had been unmistakably that of a dog detecting something significant, something related to a crime, but proving any of it would be nearly impossible. Jack was a retired officer with no official authority. Rex was an aging police dog whose final years of service were more about nostalgia than active investigation. And Walter Briggs was one of the most influential men in Milford, with connections that reached into every corner of the community's power structure. Picked up his phone and scrolled through his contacts, stopping at Chief Morrison's number. Morrison would have to listen to him, wouldn't he? They'd worked together for years, trusted each other with their lives. But even as Jack considered making the call, he could imagine Morrison's response. The case was closed. Marcus Powell had confessed. There was no evidence beyond an old dog's reaction to a scent trail that could be explained a dozen different ways. Rex appeared beside the kitchen table, his brown eyes fixed on Jack with an intensity that cut through the early morning gloom. The dog's message was clear. We know where the truth is, so why aren't we acting on it? I know, boy, Jack whispered, reaching out to stroke Rex's graying muzzle. But knowing and proving are two different things. We need more than just your nose, as good as it is. As if he understood. Rex walked to the window and stared out toward the direction of Willowbrook. His posture was alert, focused like a soldier standing guard. Jack joined him at the window, looking out at the pre-dawn darkness that blanked the quiet streets of Milford. Thoughts when Jack made a decision that would have horrified his former colleagues and probably violated several laws. If the official channels wouldn't listen to what Rex had discovered, then Jack would have to gather evidence the unofficial way. He would surveil Walter Briggs at sunrise. Jack loaded his car with equipment he'd accumulated over nearly 3 decades in law enforcement: a telephoto camera lens, recording equipment, and a cooler with food and water for a long day of observation. Rex jumped into the passenger seat. Without being asked, his tail wagging for the first time since they'd returned from Willowbrook, they parked on a side street that provided a clear view of the Briggs property while keeping Jack's car hidden behind a cluster of pine trees. From this position, Jack could observe the house and most of the backyard through his binoculars, while Rex could monitor scents carried on the morning breeze. For the first few hours, nothing unusual happened. Walter emerged from his house at 7:30 a.m., dressed in his typical business attire, and drove away in his luxury sedan. Jack documented the departure with photographs noting the time and Walter's apparent destination toward downtown Milford. But it was what happened after Walter left that made Jack's blood run cold. Around 9 a.m., a white van pulled into the Briggs driveway. Jack focused his binoculars on the vehicle and felt his heart stop when he read the side panel. Milford Storage Solutions. He recognized the company. They provided storage units and moving services throughout the county too. Men got out of the van and walked to the houses. Side entrance, they carried equipment Jack couldn't identify from his distance, but their body language suggested they were there for a specific purpose. Not a routine delivery or service. Colrex, who had been dozing in the passenger seat, suddenly lifted his head, his ears swiveled toward the Briggs property, and a low growl rumbled deep in his chest. Whatever was happening over there, Rex didn't like it. The men from the storage company disappeared into the house for nearly 2 hours. When they finally emerged, they were carrying what appeared to be several heavy boxes and a large piece of furniture wrapped in moving blankets. Jack snapped photographs as quickly as his camera would allow, zooming in on faces, license plates, and any identifying marks he could capture, but it was Rex's reaction that truly alarmed Jack. As the men loaded their cargo into the van, the old dog became increasingly agitated. He wind-paced across the car's bench seat and pressed his nose against the window, as if trying to catch a scent that remained tantalizingly out of reach. "What is it, Rex?" Jack whispered. "What do you smell?" Rex's response was a sharp bark, the same bark he'd used the day before when he'd identified Emily's scent trail. Whatever was being removed from Walter's house, Rex associated it with the missing girl. Jack's hand shook as he watched the storage company van drive away. Knowing he had no legal authority to stop it or search its contents, he memorized the license plate number and took note of the time, but felt helpless to intervene in what might be the destruction of crucial evidence. Swatter returned home around 3 p.m., and Jack watched through his binoculars as the man walked through his house, apparently inspecting the work that had been done in his absence. Walter's movements were careful, methodical, like someone checking to ensure that every trace of something had been removed. Then Walter did something that confirmed Jack's worst suspicions. He walked to the backyard, burned barrel, and added more material to the fire that was apparently still smoldering from the day before. Jack couldn't identify what Walter was burning, but the smoke was thick and dark, suggesting something more substantial than paper or yard waste. Rex began barking again, sharp and insistent, as if he could smell what was being destroyed even from their distant observation point. Jack had to restrain the dog from jumping out of the car, holding Rex's collar while trying to calm him. "Easy, boy. I know what you're smelling." As the afternoon wore on, Jack documented everything he could observe. Walter made several phone calls from his backyard, pacing near the burn barrel while speaking animatedly into his cell phone. At one point, Walter seemed to be arguing with whoever was on the other end of the line, his gestures becoming increasingly sharp and agitated. Around 5 p.m., Jack was preparing to end his surveillance for the day when something happened that made his decision for him. A police cruiser pulled into Walter's driveway. Jack focused his binoculars on the car and felt his stomach drop when he recognized Officer Danny Martinez behind the wheel. Danny was young, ambitious, and had been one of Walter's biggest supporters within the department. More troubling, Danny had been one of the officers who'd worked the original Emily Harris investigation through his telephoto lens. Jack watched as Danny and Walter stood beside the burn barrel, engaged in what appeared to be a heated conversation. Walter pointed toward the road several times in the general direction of Jack's hiding spot, while Danny nodded and took notes in his official notepad. The implications were terrifying. Either Danny was investigating Walter as part of some official inquiry Jack didn't know about, or Walter was reporting Jack's surveillance activities to a sympathetic officer. Given Danny's history with Walter, Jack suspected the latter. Rex must have sensed Jack's growing alarm because the old dog pressed against his side, offering the kind of comfort that only came from years of partnership in dangerous situations. Jack stroked Rex's head while watching Danny and Walter conclude their conversation with what appeared to be a friendly handshake as Danny drove away and Walter returned to his house. Jack made a decision that would either vindicate everything Rex had discovered or destroy both their lives. They were going to get closer to that property after dark. They were going to find out what Walter Briggs was so desperate to hide, and they were going to gather evidence that even Chief Morrison couldn't ignore. But first, Jack needed to prepare for the possibility that they wouldn't survive the night. He pulled out his cell phone and began typing a detailed message to an old friend in the state police, someone who owed Jack enough favors to take his concerns seriously. In the message, Jack detailed everything he and Rex had discovered, included the photographs he'd taken, and provided specific instructions for what should be done if something happened to the mass. Darkness began to fall over Milford. Jack sent the message and started his car. Rex sat beside him, alert and ready, as if he understood that their real work was just beginning. The old dog's nose had led them to the truth, but now it was up to Jack to make sure that truth saw the light of day, even if it killed them both. The shadows were getting longer, and Walter Briggs was running out of time to cover his tracks. But so were Jack and Rex, and Jack wasn't sure which of them would run out first. Jack waited until 2 a.m. before making his move. The streets of Milford were empty except for the occasional late shift worker heading home, and most of the houses in Willowbrook were dark. More importantly, Walter Briggs's house showed no signs of activity. No lights, no movement, no indication that anyone was awake. Rex sat in the passenger seat, his body tense with anticipation. The old dog seemed to understand that this was different from their daytime surveillance. This was active investigation, the kind of work that had defined both their careers. Despite his age, Rex's eyes were bright with an alertness Jack hadn't seen in months. They parked 3 blocks away from the Briggs property in a church parking lot that provided cover and multiple escape routes. Jack had changed into dark clothing and soft-soled shoes, while Rex's natural coloring would help him blend into the shadows. They'd done this kind of work before, though never without official sanction, and never with stakes. This height walk to Walter's property felt like the longest of Jack's life. Every shadow seemed to hide a potential threat. Every sound made him question the wisdom of what they were attempting. But Rex's confidence never wavered. The old dog moved with the sure-footed stealth of his younger years, leading Jack along a route that avoided streetlights and open areas. When they reached the edge of the Briggs property, Jack paused to study the house through his binoculars. Still dark, still quiet, but something felt wrong. A tension in the air that made the hair on his arm stand up. Rex felt it too. His ears were constantly moving, tracking sounds too subtle for human perception. They approached the house from the back, staying low and using the landscaping for cover. Walter's backyard was larger than it had appeared from the road, with several outbuildings that hadn't been visible from Jack's surveillance position. There was a storage shed, a workshop, and what appeared to be a root cellar or storm shelter built into a small hill behind the main house. Rex's behavior changed dramatically as they got closer to the buildings. The dog's nose went to the ground, sweeping back and forth in the methodical pattern Jack recognized as scent tracking, but unlike their previous searches, Rex's body language showed increasing distress. His hackles rose, his breathing became rapid and low, whines escaped from his throat. "What is it, boy?" Jack whispered, though he was afraid. He already knew the answer. Rex led him first to the storage shed. The building was secured with a padlock, but Jack could see through gaps in the wooden siding. Inside appeared to be typical yard equipment: lawn mowers, garden tools, bags of fertilizer. Nothing suspicious, nothing that would explain Rex's agitation. Then Rex moved toward the workshop, and his behavior became even more intense. The dog pawed at the door, whined, and looked back at Jack with eyes that seemed to plead for understanding. This building was also locked, but it had windows that Jack might be able to see through. Using his small flashlight with the beam carefully shielded, Jack peered into the workshop. What he saw made his blood run cold. The interior looked like it had been hastily cleaned to clean for a working shop. The concrete floor showed the telltale signs of recent scrubbing, and there were lighter patches on the walls, where something had been removed or painted over. More disturbing were the items that remained: several coils of rope, plastic sheeting, and what appeared to be bleach and other cleaning supplies arranged on a workbench. To most people, these might seem like ordinary workshop materials, but to a retired police officer who'd worked dozens of violent crimes, they looked like the tools used to clean up after something terrible. Rex's nose was pressed against the gap under the workshop door, and his whining had become more urgent. Whatever sense he was detecting inside that building, they were telling him a story that Jack didn't want to imagine. But it was when Rex led him toward the root cellar that Jack's worst fears began to take shape. The entrance to the underground structure was partially hidden behind overgrown bushes, secured with a newer lock that looked out of place. Compared to the weathered exterior, Rex's reaction to this building was unlike anything Jack had ever seen from his partner. The old dog began pawing frantically at the cellar door, his whines escalating into barely suppressed barks. Every line of Rex's body spoke of urgency, frustration, and something that might have been grief. The scents coming from this building were telling Rex things that he desperately needed Jack to understand. Jack examined the cellar entrance more carefully. The lock was new, but the door itself showed signs of recent use. Scratches around the lock mechanism, worn spots where hands had gripped the handle. Someone had been accessing this underground space regularly. Despite the neglected appearance they'd tried to maintain using tools from his surveillance kit, Jack managed to work the lock open. It took 15 minutes of careful manipulation, during which Rex paced in tight circles, his anxiety level increasing with each passing moment. When the lock finally clicked open, Rex immediately pushed past Jack and disappeared into the darkness below. Jack followed, using his flashlight to illuminate wooden steps that descended into what had originally been designed as a storm shelter. But this space had been modified extensively. The walls were lined with newer wooden panels, and the floor was covered with what appeared to be recently installed vinyl flooring. The air smelled of cleaning chemicals, but underneath that artificial scent was something else, something organic and troubling. Rex had gone directly to the far corner of the cellar, where he was pawing at a section of floor that looked slightly different from the rest. His barks were now impossible to suppress, echoing off the underground walls with an urgency that made Jack's hands shake. "Quiet, boy," Jack whispered, though he understood that Rex was beyond following commands. The dog had found something significant, and his training wouldn't allow him to ignore it. Jack examined the area where Rex was focused and realized that several of the floor tiles were newer than the others. More importantly, they weren't secured as firmly as the surrounding flooring. Using a multi-tool from his kit, Jack carefully pried up the loose tiles. What he found underneath made him sit down hard on the cellar steps, his flashlight beam shaking as the full horror of Walter Briggs's secret became clear. Below the vinyl flooring, in a shallow depression carved into the earth, lay a small wooden box. With trembling hands, Jack lifted the box and opened it. Inside were items that told the complete story of Emily Harris's fate: her school ID card, a bracelet with her name engraved on it, a small diary with entries in a child's handwriting,